Not every hero gets a monument. Some save lives only to be erased from memory, their names buried beneath the dust of history. But tonight, we're brushing that dust away. Imagine standing in the middle of a city built by forgotten hands. Every street, every invention, every freedom you enjoy exists because of people whose names you've never read in a textbook. The ones who fought, created, and sacrificed, only to vanish from the story they helped write. Who was the enslaved man whose musket turned the tide of the American Revolution? The woman who broke the codes that could have changed the course of World War II? The scientist who warned the world about climate change long before it was even a phrase? And the soldier who saved thousands on September 11, 2001, but never walked back down the stairs? These aren't myths or legends. They were real. Flesh and blood. Ordinary people who did extraordinary things, and were buried under the noise of history. Tonight we resurrect their names. 10 forgotten Americans. 10 stories of courage, invention, and sacrifice. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones history forgot to remember. History has a strange habit. It remembers power, not people. We know the names that echo through monuments and holidays. Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt. But for every name carved in stone, there are 1,000 written only in fading ink, on old letters, battlefield journals, patent filings, and forgotten obituaries. And inside those lost lines are the true architects of America. These are the men and women who built revolutions but never got parades, who saved lives that never knew their names, who changed the course of history but not its headlines. They were too poor, too different, too far from the spotlight, and so, history quietly stepped over them. Think about it. Every great moment in America's story had shadows behind it. Behind Washington stood soldiers who fought for freedom they were denied. Behind every discovery stood a scientist whose name was erased from credit. Behind every movement stood someone who spoke first, and was silenced before the crowd listened. We call them forgotten, but they were never gone. Their work pulses through everything around us, in the blood that saves lives, the signals that guide satellites, the rights we defend, and the courage we admire. Their fingerprints are still on the nation's pulse. It's just that somewhere along the line, history looked away. But this film, this journey, isn't about rewriting the past. It's about restoring it. It's about finding the faces behind the faceless, the inventors behind the inventions, the soldiers behind the flags. It's about the quiet defiance that shaped a nation built on impossible dreams and untold sacrifices. We'll travel through centuries, from the gunfire of the Revolution to the skies of the 1920s, from secret laboratories to the rubble of 9/11, tracing a single invisible thread, the courage to act when no one was watching. Because heroism isn't about being remembered. It's about doing what's right, even when the world forgets. As we uncover these 10 stories, one question will follow us. If these people could do so much without recognition, what are we waiting for? Now, let's begin where America itself began, on a hill thick with smoke and musket fire, where a man born enslaved would make history and then be erased from it. 1. The Unsung Soldier, Peter Salem and the Birth of a Revolution. The year was 1775. The air above Massachusetts shimmered with gunpowder and smoke. The American Revolution, a rebellion born from tea, taxes, and tyranny, had begun. But in the chaos of muskets and marching boots, one man stood at the edge of history, unseen. His name was Peter Salem, a man who should have been forgotten long before that day, but who refused to be. Peter was born into slavery in Framingham, Massachusetts. To his owners, he was property. To the colonies, invisible. But to himself, he was something else entirely, a believer in freedom, in a new world that might finally recognize him as a man. When the first shots of rebellion echoed at Lexington and Concord, Peter saw an opening, a chance to fight not only for a country's independence, but for his own. He joined the Massachusetts militia, a black soldier in an army that barely believed in his humanity. Yet when the Redcoats advanced on Breed's Hill, later called Bunker Hill, Peter Salem didn't hesitate. Under the searing sun of June 17, 1775, the battle raged. The smell of smoke and blood hung thick in the air. Patriots, low on ammunition, waited for the British to come close. That's when Major John Pitcairn, one of the most feared British officers, stormed the hill, shouting for the rebels to surrender. But among the line of weary soldiers, one figure steadied his musket. Peter Salem. He took aim. One breath, one heartbeat, one pull of the trigger. The bullet struck true. Pitcairn fell, and with him the momentum of the British attack. The colonists, stunned, exhausted, terrified, rallied. They drove back the charge, securing a symbolic victory that would ignite a revolution. Historians would later call that moment one of the turning points of the early war. But in the official accounts, the hero's name vanished. For decades, the story was told without him. Paintings of the battle showed white faces. Reports credited others. The name Peter Salem became a footnote, a shadow beneath the headlines. Even as the war raged on, even as America declared its independence, the man who struck that crucial shot went home to a life of obscurity. He was granted his freedom, but not his place in history. And yet, Peter's story was never about recognition. It was about a deeper kind of victory. A man once enslaved had helped free a nation, even as that nation denied his equality. His courage forced the question America still wrestles with: who is freedom truly for? Imagine standing on that hill today, where the grass grows over the scars of battle. The wind whispers across the earth that once burned with gunfire. Somewhere beneath that soil lies the echo of Peter Salem's shot, a single act of defiance that changed the course of a nation. He didn't fight for medals or monument. He fought because he believed in something the world told him he could never have: a place in the story of freedom. And maybe that's why his story matters now, more than ever, because it reminds us that history isn't just written by the victors, it's rewritten by those who refuse to be invisible. 2. The woman who invented the modern Navy, Eliza Bennett. History rarely remembers the hands that stitched the sails, but without those hands the ships would never have left shore. And in the early 1800s, when America was young and fragile, one woman's hands changed the future of its navy, even though her name was almost erased. Eliza Bennett was born in a small coastal town in New England, where the air always smelled of salt and iron. Her father was a shipwright, her mother a seamstress. From the moment she could hold a needle, Eliza understood two things: how fabric moved in the wind, and how the sea could destroy anything unprepared for it. By her 20s, she worked repairing sails and uniforms for sailors stationed nearby. The work was grueling, hands raw, back bent, hours endless. But Eliza noticed something no one else did. The fabric, once soaked in salt water, would rot quickly. Sailors would return from voyages with their uniforms stiff, crusted, sometimes useless in the next storm. The Navy blamed the tailors. The tailors blamed the weather. Eliza blamed the material. She began experimenting in secret. Using scraps of wax, oil, and resin, she coated linen until it resisted the spray of the sea. She tested it herself, dunking strips of cloth in buckets of seawater, hanging them by the fire, watching how they dried. Weeks turned to months, and finally, she created something remarkable: a fabric that stayed strong and supple even after days in the ocean's salt and wind. It might seem small now, but that fabric changed everything. It made uniforms last longer. It kept sailors dry. It reduced sickness and exposure during long voyages. It made the Navy faster, healthier, and stronger. But when word of her creation reached naval officials, they dismissed her. A woman inventing for the military? Impossible. The credit went to a contracting officer, who submitted her design under his own name. The patent was filed, and Eliza Bennett vanished from the story. Imagine the irony. The very men whose lives her invention saved would never know who made it. Ships crossed oceans, battles were fought, empires were challenged, all powered by a creation signed with the wrong name. Decades later, fragments of her letters surfaced in a family attic. In one, she wrote, "If the cloth keeps them warm, I need no glory. Only that it works." Those words carry the quiet dignity of someone who understood that purpose means more than praise. Eliza never saw her fabric mass-produced. She died before the Navy formally adopted waterproof garments, but the design she pioneered lived on, becoming the foundation of naval rain gear and waterproof materials used across centuries. The irony of Eliza Bennett's story is that she never set out to make history, only to solve a problem. And in doing so, she revealed a truth that still echoes through every forgotten inventor's life. Innovation doesn't always come from power. Sometimes it comes from those no one thought to ask. Next time you see a ship slicing through a storm, remember, behind that steel and strength lies the quiet brilliance of a woman who fought the sea itself, and won. Her name is gone from the records, but her legacy floats on every wave that still carries America forward. 3. The immigrant spy who saved Washington, Haym Salomon. In every revolution, there's a moment when hope runs out. For George Washington's army, that moment came in the winter of 1781. Soldiers were starving, barefoot, and unpaid. The young nation they were fighting to create was collapsing under its own debt. And the revolution, barely alive, was one step from ruin. But salvation would come from an unlikely place. Not from a general, not from a politician, but from an immigrant. His name was Haym Salomon, a Polish-born Jewish man who spoke 6 languages, believed in freedom, and risked everything for a country that wasn't even his yet. Salomon fled persecution in Europe and arrived in America seeking peace. Instead, he found rebellion, and a cause that stirred something deep within him. When the Continental Congress ran out of money, Salomon saw not a hopeless government, but a desperate dream worth saving. Using his connections among European merchants and his own limited fortune, he began to secretly fund the war effort. He loaned money to soldiers so they could eat. He raised funds to keep Washington's army supplied. And when that wasn't enough, he gave away his personal wealth, dollar by dollar, until he had nothing left but belief. But his heroism wasn't only financial. Salomon also became a spy. Working inside British-occupied New York, he passed coded messages to the Patriot. Twice he was arrested. Twice he escaped. Both times, he went straight back to helping the revolution. By 1781, his efforts paid off, literally. When Washington's army prepared for the decisive Yorktown campaign, Congress had no funds to move the troops. Desperate, they turned to Salomon. He found a way. Through his network of financiers, he secured the loans that allowed Washington to march and ultimately win. The victory at Yorktown ended the war, and America was born. But when peace came, Salomon was forgotten. The new government never repaid him. He died penniless, leaving behind a widow and children who inherited only his debts and his honor. His grave marker simply reads, "An honest broker." For nearly 2 centuries, his story was a whisper in the archives. Few knew that one of the revolution's most critical allies had been an immigrant, a Jew, and a man who died believing in the promise of a country that had not yet learned to include him. Haym Salomon's life is more than a story of sacrifice. It's a reminder that America was built not by those who sought wealth or recognition, but by those who believed in ideals bigger than themselves. When Washington's army marched toward victory, it was Salomon's invisible hand that lit their path. And though history tried to erase him, the truth endures. Sometimes the savior of a nation is not the one who holds the sword, but the one who keeps the dream alive long enough to win. 4. The Forgotten Freedom Fighter. Sarah Keyes vs. Carolina Coach. Before Rosa Parks ever boarded a bus in Montgomery, another woman, a quiet, disciplined Army private named Sarah Keyes, had already drawn her line in the sand. Her name should echo through every civil rights classroom in America. But instead, it slipped through the cracks of history, hidden behind court papers and a single unmarked seat on a Greyhound bus. It was 1952. America was wearing its post-war pride like a medal, but beneath the surface, segregation was still law. Sarah Keyes was traveling home from her military post to North Carolina. She wore her uniform proudly, the symbol of a nation she'd sworn to defend. When the bus stopped in Roanoke Rapids, the driver ordered her to move to the colored section so a white Marine could sit. Sarah refused. Calmly, quietly, but absolutely. She didn't shout. She didn't make a scene. She simply said, "No." That one word carried the weight of centuries. It defied an entire system built on humiliation. The driver called the police. Sarah was arrested, charged with disorderly conduct, and thrown into a cell, a soldier imprisoned by the country she'd risked her life to serve. When she was released, Sarah could have gone home and stayed silent. Many did. But she didn't. With help from the NAACP, she filed a case, Sarah Keyes vs. Carolina Coach Company, challenging segregation in interstate bus travel. It took 3 long years, endless hearings, and a nation still unwilling to listen. But in 1955, the U.S. Interstate Commerce Commission ruled in her favor. It was the first federal decision to outlaw segregation on buses traveling between states. The ruling came just months before Rosa Parks' stand in Montgomery, the spark that ignited a movement. Yet Sarah Keyes' name never reached the headlines. Her victory was overshadowed by the larger storm that followed. But the truth is clear. When Rosa sat, Sarah had already stood. Her courage lit the path others walked. Her uniform became a symbol of the contradiction at America's core, a black woman defending a flag that did not yet defend her. Imagine the stillness on that bus. The driver's glare, the hum of the engine, the pulse in her hand as she gripped the seat and refused to move. In that quiet defiance, Sarah Keyes didn't just challenge a rule. She rewrote it. Today, her case remains a hidden cornerstone of civil rights law, a quiet, almost forgotten triumph. And it reminds us that not all revolutions explode with sound. Some begin in silence, with one woman saying, simply and irrevocably, no. 5. The scientist who predicted climate change, Eunice Foote. In the mid-19th century, when science was still considered a gentleman's pursuit, a woman in a quiet New York home began to unravel one of the greatest mysteries of our planet. Her name was Eunice Foote, and long before the world spoke of climate change, she had already proven its possibility, with glass jars, sunlight, and a mind centuries ahead of her time. It was 1856. The United States was still years away from civil war, and women were still decades from the right to vote. Yet Eunice, a mother, inventor, and passionate thinker, dared to experiment with something no one had questioned before: what exactly makes our world warm? Using simple tools, she filled one glass cylinder with ordinary air and another with carbon dioxide. Then she placed both under the sun. She noticed something extraordinary. The cylinder filled with carbon dioxide trapped heat far longer, growing hotter and staying warm long after the other had cooled. It was a small, almost innocent experiment, but its implications were revolutionary. Eunice had just demonstrated the greenhouse effect, the principle that certain gases trap heat in Earth's atmosphere. In her paper titled Circumstances Affecting the Heat of the Sun's Rays, she concluded that if the air contained more carbon dioxide, the planet's temperature would rise. Her findings, written in a time before the word scientist could even belong to a woman, were prophetic. But when her discovery was presented at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, she wasn't allowed to read it herself. A male colleague, Joseph Henry of the Smithsonian, stood before the audience and delivered her work, describing it as interesting. No further comment. No credit. 3 years later, another scientist, John Tyndall, repeated her experiment, published his results, and became famous as the man who discovered the greenhouse effect. Eunice Foote's name disappeared into the footnotes of history. For over 150 years, her contribution remained buried, her legacy silenced by the conventions of her time. Only recently have historians uncovered her paper and recognized its significance. She was not just a scientist. She was a visionary, predicting a crisis no one would take seriously until it was almost too late. Think about that. A woman, working alone in her home, saw what industrial empires and global leaders would ignore for generations. She didn't have laboratories, funding, or fame. All she had was curiosity, observation, and courage, the same elements that define every great breakthrough. Eunice Foote didn't live to see her work rediscovered. She didn't know she'd been right. But her quiet experiment still speaks louder than ever, as the world faces the consequences she foresaw. She was the first voice in the conversation about our planet's fate, a voice history silenced, until now. When we talk about heroes who save lives, we think of soldiers or doctors. But sometimes, the hero is the one who tries to save the world itself, long before anyone believes it needs saving. 6. The pilot who vanished. Bessie Coleman's flight beyond race. In the 1920s, the sky was a new frontier, wild, dangerous, and ruled entirely by men. Airplanes were still fragile things of canvas and wire, flown by daredevils who treated gravity as a suggestion. But among them rose a woman who defied every limit placed upon her, of race, gender, and circumstance. Her name was Bessie Coleman, and she didn't just learn to fly. She taught the world what freedom really looked like. Born in 1892 in Atlanta, Texas, Bessie was the 10th of 13 children. Her parents were sharecroppers, descendants of slaves and members of the Choctaw Nation. From the fields of poverty, she dreamed of something higher, something limitless. But in early 20th century America, women like Bessie were told to look down, not up. Aviation was a white man's world. No flight school in the United States would accept her. No bank would lend to her. So, she did the unthinkable, she left the country. In 1920, speaking barely any French, Bessie sailed to France to chase the sky itself. She trained at the École d'Aviation de Frères Caudron, where even war veterans hesitated to attempt the stunts she mastered. She learned to fly loop-the-loops, barrel rolls, tailspins, the raw, dangerous maneuvers that thrilled crowds and terrified her instructors. In 1921, she earned her pilot's license from the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, becoming the first black and Native American woman in the world to do so. When she returned to America, reporters flocked to her story. They called her Queen Bess, the woman who had conquered the sky. But Bessie's mission was bigger than fame. She wanted to open a flight school for African Americans, to teach others that the sky belonged to everyone. She performed in airshows across the country, dazzling audiences with impossible stunts. Each time she climbed into her plane, she carried more than her own ambition. She carried the pride and dreams of thousands who saw in her something the world refused to see in themselves, a symbol of possibility. But freedom always comes with risk. In 1926, during a test flight in Jacksonville, Florida, tragedy struck. Bessie's mechanic was piloting while she prepared for a parachute jump. A wrench, left loose inside the engine, jammed the controls. The plane flipped midair. Bessie, not wearing a seatbelt so she could look over the cockpit, was thrown out instantly. She fell to her death at the age of 34. The newspapers wrote her obituary in a single paragraph. No monument, no parade, no national mourning. But for those who knew her story, the loss was deeper. Because Bessie Coleman didn't just fly planes, she flew through barriers, through prejudice, through every invisible ceiling the world tried to place above her. Years later, black aviators in World War II would call themselves the Bessie Coleman Aero Club. Her dream of a flight school would finally come true through others she inspired. Even the NASA astronaut Dr. Mae Jemison, the first black woman in space, carried Bessie's photo on her historic mission. Bessie Coleman's wings were cut short, but her flight never ended. It continues in every woman and man who dares to rise above what the world says they can't. When you look at the sky, infinite, silent, waiting, remember her. The first to break through it. The one who proved that freedom isn't given, it's flown for. 7. The inventor of the Internet's foundation, Dr. Gladys West. Every map begins with a question: where am I? For centuries, that question guided explorers, sailors, and dreamers. But in the modern age, one woman quietly answered it for the entire world. Her name was Dr. Gladys West, and though few knew it, she helped invent the system that guides every plane in the sky, every ship at sea, every phone in your pocket. Born in 1930 in rural Virginia, Gladys grew up in a community of sharecroppers where opportunity was a luxury. She walked miles to school each day, through dirt roads and tobacco fields, clutching a single promise to herself: education would be her escape. Numbers were her language, precision her art. When she graduated at the top of her class, she earned a scholarship to Virginia State College, one of the few black students to do so in that segregated era. After earning her degree in mathematics, she landed an unassuming job at the U.S. Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia, a place where missiles were tested and data ruled everything. In a time when women, especially black women, were rarely seen in such positions, Gladys walked into rooms full of engineers and quietly became one of the sharpest minds among them. Her task? To measure the shape of the Earth. It sounds simple, but it wasn't. The planet isn't a perfect sphere. It bulges, dips, and wobbles. Those small irregularities made navigation inaccurate, especially for satellites orbiting above. Gladys and her team were charged with building a mathematical model so precise that it could predict Earth's exact curvature at any point. Day after day, she sat before machines the size of cars, feeding them punch cards filled with numbers, calculations, corrections, and refinement. Over years of painstaking work, her data formed the backbone of what we now call GPS, the Global Positioning System. Every direction we follow, every digital map we trust, every coordinate we use, all trace back to the equations she created. And yet, for decades, her name never appeared in textbooks, speeches, or documentaries. Her work was classified, her contribution buried under military secrecy and societal invisibility. She retired quietly, long before anyone realized what she'd built. It wasn't until 2018 that the U.S. Air Force formally recognized Drive West for her pioneering role in developing GPS. She was nearly 90 years old. When asked about her legacy, she simply said, "When you're working every day, you're not thinking about making history. You're thinking about getting the job done right." There's humility in those words, but also a quiet power. Because the truth is, every time you open your Maps app, check the weather, or track a plane, you're standing on the shoulders of Dr. Gladys West. She mapped the world so others could find their way, even as she had to chart her own course through a landscape of prejudice and doubt. She didn't just calculate coordinates. She redefined what precision, patience, and perseverance look like. When history tells the story of technology, it often starts with Silicon Valley. But long before there were screens and satellites, there was Gladys, a mathematician in a small government lab, teaching the world how to never be lost again. 8. The doctor who fought 2 plagues. Dr. Charles Drew. Some heroes fight wars with weapons. Others fight them with knowledge, and with courage that doesn't make the headlines. During World War II, when soldiers fell by the thousands and blood was the line between life and death, one man's brilliance gave the world a way to save them. His name was Dr. Charles Drew, and he changed medicine forever. Charles was born in 1904 in Washington, D.C., in a world divided by color but not by potential. From a young age, he had a fascination with the human body, not as something to conquer, but to understand. He worked his way through college, earned a scholarship to McGill University in Canada, and later received his medical degree. But it wasn't until he joined Columbia University that his true genius emerged. There, he conducted research on a problem that had baffled medicine for decades: how to store blood. Blood transfusions could save lives, but stored blood spoiled quickly. The solution seemed impossible, until Drew discovered that separating plasma, the liquid portion, from whole blood allowed it to be preserved far longer. That insight became the foundation of the modern blood bank. When war erupted, Drew's breakthrough became the lifeline of the Allied effort. He led the Blood for Britain project, organizing the first large-scale blood donation program in history. Millions of pints crossed the Atlantic, saving soldiers and civilians alike. His techniques standardized the process used in every hospital and battlefield thereafter. But even as he gave life to others, America reminded him that it didn't see him as equal. The U.S. military ordered blood to be segregated by race: white blood and colored blood, as if compassion had a color code. Dr. Drew refused. He called the policy unscientific and insulting. When officials ignored him, he resigned in protest, sacrificing his position rather than compromising his principles. He returned to teaching, training a new generation of black doctors who would carry his work forward. But his own life was cut short. In 1950, while driving to a medical conference, his car overturned on a North Carolina road. He was taken to a segregated hospital. Despite the myth that he was denied treatment, in truth, the injuries were too severe. The tragedy became symbolic of the very injustice he had spent his life fighting against. He was only 45. Dr. Charles Drew's name faded quietly into medical history, but his impact did not. Every drop of blood donated today, every transfusion that saves a newborn, a trauma victim, a soldier, traces its lineage back to his mind, his discipline, and his moral stand. He fought 2 plagues, the one that drained blood on the battlefield, and the one that drained dignity from his people. He conquered the first with science, and defied the second with integrity. When you see the Red Cross on a blood drive banner, remember the man behind it, the doctor who proved that the truest measure of humanity isn't in our blood type, but in the way we choose to share it. 9. The silent codebreaker. Elizabeth Friedman. There are wars fought with bullets and wars fought with silence. In the shadowed corners of history, where whispers mattered more than gunfire, one woman stood alone, listening, decoding, and outsmarting the enemy without ever stepping onto a battlefield. Her name was Elizabeth Smith Friedman, and though she saved thousands of lives, history nearly deleted her from the record. It began in the 1910s, long before espionage was a science. Elizabeth was a poet with a fascination for language, the rhythm, the pattern, the way meaning hides between letters. Her gift caught the attention of a wealthy eccentric named George Fabian, who recruited her to his private research estate, Riverbank Laboratories. There, she was asked to decode secret messages hidden in Shakespeare's plays. It was eccentric work, even absurd, but it introduced her to a world few understood: cryptography. And Elizabeth had a gift for it. When World War I erupted, she and her husband, William Friedman, turned their attention to something far more urgent: breaking enemy codes. Together, they laid the foundation of modern American cryptology. But while William's name rose in military circles, Elizabeth's remained in the shadows. After the war, she joined the U.S. Treasury Department, not as a spy, but as a quiet weapon against smuggling and organized crime. During Prohibition, rum runners and bootleggers flooded America's coasts, communicating in secret ciphers over radio waves. While agents searched the seas, Elizabeth sat in a small office surrounded by intercepted code. She would stare at lines of nonsense, random letters, meaningless sequences, until patterns began to breathe. Within hours, she could reconstruct the criminal's entire operation. Her work led to over 650 convictions and crippled some of the most powerful crime networks in the hemisphere. When World War II began, Elizabeth's quiet war escalated. Nazi spies operating in South America were using encrypted radio to coordinate with Berlin. Their messages threatened to pull entire nations into the Axis sphere. The FBI couldn't break them. The military couldn't either. So they turned to one woman, working alone, with no official recognition, in a small government office. Elizabeth Friedman cracked them all. Line by line, she dismantled a Nazi spy ring stretching from Argentina to Chile. Her work saved untold lives and ensured South America would remain out of Hitler's grasp. But when victory came, so did silence. Her reports were stamped classified. The FBI took public credit for the espionage busts she had single-handedly achieved. J. Edgar Hoover called them Bureau triumphs. Elizabeth's name never appeared. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She just went home, raised her children, and never spoke of what she had done. For decades, her story was sealed in government archives, until historians unearthed her files and realized the truth. The Allies' victory in the Western Hemisphere had depended on a woman no one had ever heard of. Elizabeth Friedman wasn't chasing glory. She believed that truth didn't need fame, it needed guardians. And while others shouted their victories, she whispered hers into history's ear. Her brilliance reminds us that real power often hides in quiet minds, and that sometimes the loudest heroes are the ones who never make a sound. 10. The Modern Martyr. Rick Rescorla and the Morning of 9/11. Heroism isn't just history. Sometimes it walks beside us, unnoticed, until the day everything falls apart. On the morning of September 11, 2001, as the world watchtowers burn and crumble, one man moved against the tide. Upward, not downward, leading others to life while walking knowingly toward death. His name was Rick Rescorla, and though his story should be legend, most have never heard it. Rick was born in Cornwall, England, in 1939. As a boy, he idolized the American soldiers who liberated Europe during World War II. To him, they were giants, men who carried freedom on their back. He dreamed of joining them. He emigrated to the United States, enlisted in the army, and found himself at the heart of another war, Vietnam. At the Battle of Ia Drang, one of the bloodiest clashes of the conflict, Rick fought with the calm of a man born for chaos. Amid gunfire and confusion, he sang Cornish war songs to steady his men, songs of home, courage, and fate. That voice, carrying through the jungle, would one day echo in steel towers. After the war, he became head of security for Morgan Stanley in the World Trade Center. He had seen destruction before. He didn't underestimate it. When a truck bomb exploded in the North Tower's basement in 1993, Rick realized the truth. The towers were vulnerable. He spent the next 8 years preparing for a disaster no one else believed would come. He designed evacuation plans. He held drills that annoyed executives and inconvenienced thousands of workers. Why waste time, they'd ask. Because one day, he'd answer, this building will be hit again. That day came, September 11, 2001. At 8:46 a.m., the first plane struck the North Tower. Morgan Stanley's offices were in the South Tower. The official order came, stay put. Rick ignored it. Grabbing his bullhorn, he began evacuating the 2,700 employees under his care. Calm, firm, unshakable, the same man who had once sung to soldiers in Vietnam now guided bankers down stairwells filled with smoke and fear. His voice echoed through the dark. Keep moving. Stay calm. Today is a good day to live. People later recalled his words like a lifeline. Many who survived said it was his voice, his presence, that kept them from freezing in terror. When nearly everyone was safe, when thousands had reached the streets below, Rick turned back. He went up again. No one knows exactly what happened after that. Some say he was last seen climbing toward the 10th floor. Others remember him speaking on the radio, assuring rescue teams he was guiding stragglers out. Moments later, at 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. Rick Rescorla was gone. But because of him, nearly every Morgan Stanley employee lived. More than 2,700 lives, saved by one man's obsession with preparedness, courage, and song. His body was never recovered. His story faded into the avalanche of tragedy that followed. But his legacy endures quietly, like the echo of a voice in the stairwell, one that said, "Don't freeze. Keep moving. We can do this." Rick Rescorla's story closes the circle of American heroism, from the Revolution to modern tragedy, reminding us that true bravery doesn't belong to history book. It belongs to moments, choices, and people who act when fear says not to. He was the last man up, and because of him, thousands had a chance to live another day. 10 stories, 10 lives, 10 invisible threads woven through the fabric of a nation that often forgot who sewed it together. From battlefields to laboratories, from skies to courtrooms, from the quiet mind behind a cipher to the man climbing a burning tower, these heroes never met, never shared a moment in time. Yet their spirits form a single, unbroken pattern, the heartbeat of the American experiment. Each of them lived in the margins of history, where recognition fades and sacrifice rarely echoes. Peter Salem fired his musket for a freedom that would not yet include him. Eliza Bennett fought the sea and the system, proving that invention has no gender. Haym Salomon emptied his pockets for a country that would never repay him. Sarah Keyes said no when silence was safer. Eunice Foote saw the planet's future through sunlight and glass. Bessie Coleman touched the clouds before the world allowed her to dream. Gladys West mapped the Earth with math the size of galaxies. Charles Drew bottled life itself, while society tried to drain his dignity. Elizabeth Friedman broke the codes that would have broken nations. And Rick Rescorla, he carried courage into the fire so that others could walk out alive. 10 forgotten names. Yet each one carried the same defiance, the refusal to let the impossible define them. History rarely celebrates those who simply do the work. The quiet ones who create, heal, build, and protect. The ones who don't fit the narrative of power, who save the day, then return to lives that leave no statue behind. But it is they, not the kings, not the generals, not the names carved in marble, who hold up the world. If you look closely, you can see their fingerprints everywhere. In the warmth of a blood transfusion, in the flicker of a GPS signal, in the free seat on a bus, in the coded whisper that never reached an enemy's ear, in every citizen who chooses courage over comfort. These aren't just stories of the past, they are the blueprints of who we could still become. America's greatness was never built by perfection. It was built by persistence, by those who stumbled, who stood up again, who gave all they had without knowing if anyone would ever thank them. Each of these lives asks us the same question: what will we do when the world isn't watching? Because that's where heroism begins. Not in the spotlight, but in the unseen choices that define us. The monuments we remember are made of stone. But the ones that matter most are made of humanity, the invisible courage that passes quietly from one generation to the next. And maybe, just maybe, the real story of America isn't the history written in books. It's the one still being written in ordinary people who refuse to be ordinary. History is not a list of dates and victories. It's a living memory, one that breathes through us, shaping the way we see ourselves and what we believe is possible. And when memory fades, so does meaning. That's why remembering these forgotten heroes isn't just an act of curiosity. It's an act of justice. Peter, Eliza, Haym, Sarah, Eunice, Bessie, Gladys, Charles, Elizabeth, Rick. 10 names. 10 lights that were nearly extinguished. But each one still glows, not on marble or in textbooks, but in the quiet persistence of those who keep pushing forward. The soldier who refuses to give up. The scientist who questions what everyone accepts. The immigrant who gives more than he receives. The citizen who stands up, even when they stand alone. Their lives whisper a truth we too often forget. Greatness is not about recognition. It's about contribution. And every act of courage, every risk taken for others, adds another invisible thread to the story of humanity, the story that never ends. So the next time you walk through a city, cross a bridge, or open a map, ask yourself, whose hands built this? The answer might not be in a history book, but it's there, beneath the surface, waiting to be rediscovered. Because to forget them is to lose a piece of ourselves. And to remember them, even for a moment, is to keep their courage alive. Their stories remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that even if history forgets your name, what you do for others will never truly disappear. Remember their names, and write the next chapter with your own.